Welcome back, everybody, to Fresh Catholic Teaching Courses. This is series number 7, our Lenten series, where we are journeying through the original days of the original Holy Week, unpacking what happened on each of those days. So when we get into Holy Week 2025, as we go through each day of this year's Holy Week, we'll be able to reflect on what happened on the same day of the original Holy Week and enter in more deeply and profoundly. This is episode number 4, and we're going to do 2 days this episode. We're going to do Tuesday and Wednesday of Holy Week, and the unofficial names of each of these days. Tuesday has been always called Teaching Tuesday, and Wednesday has been called Spy Wednesday. So we're going to do Tuesday and Wednesday, both of them on this episode, episode number 4. So we left Jesus. He cursed the fig tree on Monday. He cursed the fig tree. He cleansed the temple. They went back to Bethany, spent Monday evening at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. It is now Tuesday morning. So same drill. Jesus and his disciples leave Bethany. They head back into Jerusalem. And Jesus heads to the temple area where he's going to spend the day teaching the crowds that have come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And in the midst of these teaching, in the midst of his teaching, one by one, the different factions of Jewish religious leaders is going to come up to him in full view of the crowd and ask him a question. But they're not asking him a question because they want to find out the answer. This is not a legitimate question. They're asking him the question because what they want to do is they want to trap him. They want to put him on what we call the horns of a dilemma. So whatever way he answers it, he's going to be wrong. And then they can point to him and say, look, everybody, he's a fraud. Don't follow him. Come back and follow us. That's what they're hoping to do as they pepper Jesus with these questions. But they make a huge mistake, okay? Because they don't realize, because they don't acknowledge that this guy is not just a guy, he's also God. And you're never going to trap God. So rather than discrediting Jesus, we'll see Jesus turn it around and discredit them in front of the crowds. And they got to go back with their tail between their legs, so to speak, because they have, in front of these crowds, they have been discredited. Not only do they have egg on their face, they have like a 3-egg omelet on their face, right? And this further fuels their fire that they have got to get rid of this guy, right? So Teaching Tuesday, very critical. It really stokes, it puts a couple of more logs on the fire of them wanting to destroy Jesus and get him out of their hair once and for all. So, Jesus is in the temple area. He's teaching. Now, we said the various factions of Jewish religious leaders. Who are these factions? Well, at one point, the Pharisees are going to come up, and they're going to pose a question to Jesus. Now, we're probably, to a degree, familiar with the Pharisees. We've heard them. They appear a lot in Scripture. They and Jesus have had a lot of back and forth. There's really no love lost between them, right, so to speak. The Pharisees, the word Pharisee means separated ones. And who the Pharisees were is they were, Jewish men who kind of took it upon themselves to make sure that never again did the Jewish people violate the law. Because in the past, one of the reasons why they were exiled, the Babylonian exile, the Assyrian exile, was for punishment for violating the law. So these men just like like we said yesterday, the process of the merchants and the money changers, it was a good idea, but then it was kind of perverted. Same thing here. The intent was good. These men said, look, we want to make sure that never again do we violate the law. Never again are we going to be exiled. So what they took it upon themselves to do was what we say they built a fence around the law, okay? And this fence came in the form of all kinds of man-made rules and regulations so that you wouldn't get close to getting close to violate the law. Give you an example, all right? One of the big laws was keep holy the Sabbath day. Huge, right? So, and remember, keep holy the Sabbath day, no work on the Sabbath. Well, the Pharisees said, okay, we got to keep the Sabbath holy. In order to do that, we can't do any work. But we got to make sure we properly define what work is, so people know what they can't do, and therefore they don't come close to violating the Sabbath law. So they defined work all different ways. You couldn't carry a certain thing a certain distance. You couldn't carry certain things over a certain weight. I mean, the rules and regulations they made surrounding not working on the Sabbath so you didn't violate the Sabbath, that became so burdensome. So they had a good intent. We never want to violate the Sabbath law. We never want to break the Mosaic law in any way. So to make sure we don't do that, we are going to make so many rules and regulations that you can't even come close to violate. You can't even think about violating it. So the intent was good, but they perverted it, and they made these rules and regulations so difficult to carry out and so burdensome. So that's who the Pharisees were. Now, another faction of the Jewish religious leaders were the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees they basically came from the aristocracy. That's where the priests came from. And they were involved in a lot of the temple activity. And the Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. And we have a running joke in theology, you've probably heard it, because the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection and angels. That's why they were sad, you see. Okay, I know, Charles, keep your day job. But anyway, that's who the Sadducees are. Then you have another faction, the Herodians. And again, King Herod was the king of the Jews at this point, but he was what we call a puppet king. In other words, in order to be a true king of the Jewish people, you had to be a full-blooded Jewish person. Herod wasn't. He was only half Jewish. So technically, he couldn't be king of the Jews. Rome put him in that position as kind of a puppet king so that they can kind of use him how they wanted to keep the Jewish people in check. Now, Herod knew he wasn't a legitimate king. He knew he was only in that position because Rome put him there. He knew he was a puppet king, and he knew that the Jewish people knew that. He knew that Jewish people had no respect for him at all as a legitimate king. And because of that, he became very paranoid of anybody possibly taking this position away from him. So paranoid that, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, he killed his own wife and he killed several of his own children because for some reason he thought maybe they were going to take the throne from him. So he was very paranoid and very vicious. And he was very erratic. You never knew what he was going to do, right? So the Herodians were a faction of Jewish religious leaders that tried to curry favor with Herod, that basically told Herod, look, Herod, you know, the Jewish people, they don't see you, they don't respect you as a legitimate king because basically you're not. But Herod, you know, you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. Herod, we'll have your back if, you know, you kind of do things the way we want you to do them. That's who the Herodians were. They were more political than they were religious. And then you have the scribes. We've heard about them. The scribes were the scholars. They were basically the theologians of the day. They spent their time studying and teaching the Mosaic Law and the Scriptures. So when we say each of the factions of Jewish religious leaders posed a question to Jesus on this day, Tuesday, trying to discredit them, that's who these factions are. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, and the scribes. They each come to Jesus. They each pose their own question, thinking it will trap him, put him on the horns of a dilemma. Whatever way he answers is going to be wrong, and he's going to be discredited in front of these massive crowds that he's teaching to. Now, in the time frame we have here, I don't have the time to go through each of their questions, but I'll pick out two of them just to give you the flavor of what how these questions were designed to trap Jesus and how Jesus got out of the trap. And rather than them discrediting Jesus, Jesus winds up discrediting them in front of everybody. So we'll just take two as an example, and I'll pick two of the probably more widely known ones, okay? Here's our first example of the types of questions these factions posed to Jesus to try and trap and discredit him, okay? Example number one, the Pharisees come up, all right? Now, keep in mind, they've designed this question as a no-win situation for Jesus, right? And they're pretty confident that they're going to get what they're after, all right? So, here's the question, and we know it well. It's famous. They say, remember, crowds are all around, right? This is in the temple area. They say, hey, Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, remember in our first episode, when you hear the word Caesar, recall Caesar is not the name of a person, it's the name of a position. Caesar is the leader of Rome, and various individuals filled that position of Caesar. Now, the person filling the position of Caesar at this time is Tiberius. So when the Pharisees say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? What they're saying is it lawful to pay taxes to Tiberius? Because that's who the Caesar was at this time. Now, on the surface, it sounds like, how is this going to trap Jesus and discredit him? How is this going to put him on the horns of a dilemma? Well, look at how they crafted the question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, they're trying to get a yes or no answer from Jesus. Real simple question, right? To Jesus, real simple answer. But here's the problem. If Jesus answers yes, it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, then the Jewish people are going to be irate because they hate Caesar. Caesar's oppressing them, right? Rome is oppressing them, all right? Caesar is the worst of guys. So if Jesus says, yeah, pay taxes to Caesar, the Jewish people are going to be upset because they were being taxed to death. You think we got a lot of taxes, and we do. They had taxes on everything. So taxes was a very sensitive subject for the Jewish people. And if Jesus says, yes, pay all these taxes, then the Jewish people are going to be upset at Jesus, and he's going to lose their support if he says yes. If he says no, it's not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, then in essence, he's committing treason. He's going against Caesar and Rome. So whatever way he answers, they figure he's going to be in a no-win situation. If he says pay taxes, the Jewish people, he'll lose them. That's blasphemy in their eyes. If he says no, don't pay taxes, he'll be in trouble with Rome because that's treason. So when they pose this question, hey, Jesus, yes or no, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? They're sitting there in the few seconds it takes Jesus to respond, and you can almost imagine they're patting themselves on the back. They're saying, oh, God, this guy is going to be discredited. The crowd is going to look at him as a complete fraud. They're going to ditch him and come back to us, okay? They posed it as an either-or question, yes or no. But the problem is, they thought they were dealing with a mere man. They're actually dealing with God, right? And you're not going to put God on the horns of a dilemma. You're not going to trap him. So how does Jesus answer? He basically says, look, guys, you're posing this as an either-or situation, when really it's a both-and, okay? Because look at his answer. He says, look, first of all, this is often missed, right? He says, show me a coin. And the Pharisees take a coin out of their pocket and show it to him. And he says, whose image is on that? And they say, Caesar, okay? So Jesus says, well, okay, here. If Caesar's image is on the coin, pay Caesar his coin, okay? But let me drop in a little side note here. They're in the temple area, right? Now, remember last episode? One of the reasons they had money changers was because you had to exchange your Roman coinage with Caesar's image for coinage that was okay to use in the temple, okay? This is in the temple area. These are the Pharisees. Jesus asked them for a coin. They bring out a Roman coin, which they shouldn't have even had because they're in the temple area. And that's oftentimes missed. But nevertheless, they bring out this coin. He says, whose image is on it? They say Caesar. And basically Jesus says, look, Caesar's image is on the coin. Pay Caesar his coin. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Render to God what is God's. Now, the coin had Caesar's image on it. Give it to him. Who are we created in the image of? God. So render to Caesar his coin, render to God your lives. Because the coin has Caesar's image, we are made in the image and likeness of God. So Jesus is saying you can do both, okay? You can be a good citizen and pay taxes to Caesar, and you can be a good Jewish person and give your lives to God, all right? You can do both. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Now the Pharisees, you can imagine the Pharisees, right? All right? They're patting themselves on the back. They're thinking, okay, whatever way Jesus answers, he's going to be discredited. Jesus gives them back the answer, and you can imagine their shock. Jesus has not only got out of the trap, but in doing so, instead of them discrediting him, he's discrediting them. And you can imagine the crowd, right? They're sitting there, right? The Pharisees are asking him this question. And the question is hanging in the air, right? So the crowd is looking at the Pharisees. The Pharisees ask Jesus this question. Then the crowd is looking at Jesus, waiting for an answer, right? Jesus answers, right? And discredits the Pharisees. And you can imagine the crowd looking back at the Pharisees going, oh, he got you bad, right? So now the Pharisees are totally discredited in front of the crowds. So they leave, in essence, with their tail between their legs, and they leave fuming mad because Jesus has turned the tables completely around. So that's one example of a question one of the factions asked him, the Pharisees. Let's go to another example. The Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection, right? They come up and they pose a question. Now, you would think, after seeing how bad Jesus made the Pharisees look, you would think the Sadducees would have taken note of that and they would have said, we thought we had a good question. But after seeing how Jesus handled the Pharisees' question, guys, maybe we better just kind of slink away. Maybe our question is not as good as we think it is. But nevertheless, arrogant, I guess that they are, they step forward, they pose their own question. Now again, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They thought the resurrection was stupid and silly, right? Who could believe that, right? So it's no surprise their question revolved around the resurrection. And they gave Jesus kind of a hypothetical situation from which they posed a question, okay? And their intent was to show how utterly ridiculous the resurrection is. And Jesus, in preaching a resurrection, it'll show how ridiculous Jesus is in preaching this in the first place. So here's their question. Here's the hypothetical situation. They say there's a woman, right? She marries a man, okay? Husband. He dies. She marries a second husband. He dies. A third, he dies. A fourth, he dies. In other words, she marries multiple men and have multiple husbands. They all die. Eventually, she dies. All right? Now, here's the question. Jesus, this woman had multiple husbands, right? They're all dead now. In the resurrection, who of all the men she married when she was alive, in the resurrection, which one of those is going to be her husband? All right? And they're asking that in front of the crowds. And in essence, they're saying, see, crowds, how ridiculous this resurrection thing is. Who will be your husband? Is it going to be the first one, the second one, the third one? And who's going to decide? All right? See all the problems this resurrection thing brings up? It's stupid. It's silly. Who can believe it? All right? So they think they got a pretty good question because they think they've posed a really good hypothetical. So they're, again, you're the crowd, right? You're looking at the Sadducees. You listen to their question. They ask Jesus, hey, who will be your husband? Which of the multiple men will be your husband in the next life, in the resurrection? So the question's hanging in the air. The crowd turns their attention to Jesus because they're looking at him to give his answer. What does Jesus say? In essence, he says, guys, come on. He goes, you should know that life in heaven is not going to be like life on earth. In heaven, there's going to be no marrying and no giving of marriage. In heaven, people will be like, they won't be, more about that in a second, they'll be like the angels. Now, when Jesus says that life in heaven is going to be different than life on earth, there's going to be no marrying, people are going to be like angels, what is he getting to? Well, he's saying, look, in heaven, again, marriage has two dimensions. There's a unitive and a procreative dimension. And because in heaven, there'll be no more need to procreate, there'll be no more need for marriage. And there'll be no more need for sexual activity. And because the angels are pure spirits and don't have bodies, we'll be like angels in that we won't be procreating. So he says, you're trying to, pose a hypothetical that makes resurrection look ridiculous. Well, your idea of what it's going to be like in heaven is ridiculous. You're assuming life in heaven is going to be exactly like life on earth, and it's not going to be. And you guys, you're a faction of the Jewish religious leaders, Even if you don't believe in the resurrection, certainly you must know that it's going to be different. So when when Jesus basically mocks them, if you will, for not knowing that, for thinking life in heaven is going to be like the same as life on earth, he basically discredits them in front of the crowds. So once again, when Jesus answers, the crowds then turn back to the Sadducees, and again they're saying, oh, he got you guys too, all right? So now the Sadducees leave with their tail between their legs, and they're infuriated. So those are two examples of the questions, the types of questions these various factions of Jewish religious leaders posed to Jesus. Not because they were seeking a legitimate answer, but because they want to trap him and discredit him in front of the crowds, and the result is he turns it right around and discredits them. That's what happens on Teaching Tuesday, because they pose these questions to Jesus on Tuesday while he's teaching in the temple area. So after the day ends, Tuesday ends, Jesus and his disciples again leave Jerusalem, go back to Bethany, and spend Tuesday night at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. That's Teaching Tuesday. Now we'll move to Spy Wednesday. So Tuesday night ends, it's now Wednesday morning. Same drill, different day. Jesus and disciples leave Bethany, leave the house of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. They go back into Jerusalem. Jesus, and if you look at this day, Spy Wednesday, imagine yourself looking at your TV screen, and the TV screen kind of has a split screen. And there's one event going on the left-hand side and another event going on simultaneously on the right-hand side. That's kind of how, I want to approach Spy Wednesday. Because on Spy Wednesday, Jesus is back in the temple area doing more teaching to the crowds, while Judas is cutting his deal to betray him with the Jewish religious leaders. So you've got Jesus teaching and Judas cutting his deal. Both of them are going on during Spy Wednesday. So we're going to leave Jesus and his teaching aside. We're going to focus on Judas, okay? So while Jesus is teaching in the temple area, meanwhile, Judas is going to the Jewish religious leaders to cut his deal to betray Jesus. Now, let's set the context, right? The Jewish religious leaders, they have been for a while back now, Jesus, really since the beginning of his public ministry, has been a thorn in their sides. These are the Jewish religious leaders. They're used to the crowds following them. They were in charge of the Jewish religious system, right? So the crowds followed them. They had the power. They had the stature. They had the position. Now Jesus comes along, and now all of a sudden the crowds are starting to leave them and follow him. And they're getting a little jealous, right? Because now they're starting to lose their power and their prestige and their stature, right? Because people are leaving them and going to Jesus. So Jesus, as he goes through his public ministry, is becoming a sharper and sharper thorn in their sides. And they've been thinking, all along, we got to get rid of this guy. We got to get this guy out of our hair. We got to get the crowds following us again. And they try various ways, all right, up to and including the day before, trying to discredit him. Nothing has worked. So they finally say, look, the only way we're going to get this guy out of our hair, the only way we're going to get rid of this guy and get the crowds following us is to kill him. But they've got a big problem, don't they? This is the Feast of the Passover. Large crowds are in Jerusalem. Crowds that have followed Jesus. Crowds that have just ushered him into Jerusalem on Sunday with the red carpet treatment. And they figure, look, we want to kill this guy, But if we do it during the feast, with all the crowds here, his followers might riot. And if there's a riot, Rome is going to come down on us and make life miserable. So we want to kill him. We've already come to that conclusion. But we can't do it during the feast. But the other problem is if they don't do it during the feast, if they do it during the feast, they're worried about a riot and Rome coming down on them. If they don't do it during the feast, when the feast is over, Jesus is going to leave and he'll be out of their clutches. So they've got a huge dilemma. We want to kill this guy. We want to do it now, but we can't because we fear a riot. But if we wait, he'll escape our clutches. So what are we going to do? So they're sitting here, you can imagine, they're sitting there in their headquarters, so to speak, and they're trying to figure out how to pull this off, right? Using a little license here. So you can imagine all of a sudden as they're trying to go back and forth and they're not coming up with a solution, all of a sudden there's a knock at the door, right? So to speak. And one of the religious leaders gets up and answers the door, and there's this guy in front. And you can imagine, and again, this is not biblical, obviously. I'm in creative license a little bit here. They can imagine the rest of the Jewish religious leaders saying, well, who is it? And the one guy that opens the door says, well, there's a guy here, and he says that he has a way that you can kill Jesus and do it during the feast. You can imagine the rest of the Jewish religious leaders' ears perking up, going, oh, well, invite him in. And who is he? And then the guy that's at the door says, even better, he's one of the 12. So you can imagine the Jewish religious leaders in just unbelievable delight. Here they are trying to figure out how to kill him, but they can't during the feast, and if they wait after the feast, he'll escape their clutches, and they can't come up with a solution. Now, all of a sudden, the solution has been given to them on a silver platter. One of the 12 has arrived at their headquarters, so to speak, saying, I have a way you can kill him and kill him during the feast and not have a revolt, not have a riot. So you can imagine, they're going, this is unbelievable. Invite him in. All right? Now, what is the first, recorded-wise, what is the first thing Judas says? He says, how much will you give me to betray him? Judas wants money. Now, we know from the Gospels that Judas was the one, that he was the treasurer of the group. He's the one that kept the money bag. He was the one responsible for bringing in the donations and then doling them out. He was the treasurer of the group. But he was also a thief, and he was pilfering from that money bag. So he was all about greed. So we shouldn't be surprised that yes, Judas wants to betray Jesus, but he wants to do it for a price, because Judas was all about money. So they haggle back and forth, and they decide, as we know, the price tag on Jesus' head is 30 pieces of silver. Now again, in Scripture, we say, when the Holy Spirit inspires these writers to drop in a detail that they otherwise didn't have to do, it's for a reason. And if there's a reason, it's incumbent upon us to find out what that reason is. So the gospel writers could have said, well, they agreed on the price. No, they gave us a specific price, 30 pieces of silver. Why that detail? Because 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave. So Judas agreed to betray Jesus for the price of a slave. And the reason I mention this is this gives us a window into how much Judas, at this point, despised Jesus. That A, he was willing to betray him, and B, for the price of a slave. He despised him that much, which begs the question, doesn't it? What got Judas to the point of despising Jesus this much to betray him for the price of a slave? Well, go back to something we said at the beginning of this series, all right? The expectation of many of the Jews as to what kind of Messiah, Savior, Deliverer, King Jesus was going to be. And for many of them, they expected him to be a political, military Messiah who would stage a revolution, overthrow Caesar and Rome, establish an earthly kingdom, and lift Israel back to its glory days of David and Solomon. That was the expectation of the kind of Messiah and kingdom Jesus was going to set up. Now, the people that believe this, okay, they were called the Zealots. And the thinking has always been that Judas shared this belief. Judas expected Jesus to be that kind of Messiah. And with that expectation, Judas is thinking, okay, when Jesus does lead this revolt and overthrow Caesar and Rome and establish this earthly kingdom, us 12 guys, we're going to be part of his administration. We're going to be part of his cabinet, so to speak. And the thinking has always been, being with Jesus 24/7, 365 for 3 years, Judas slowly came to realize, wait a second, this guy is not that kind of Messiah. He's not a political military Messiah. He's not going to lead a revolution. He's not going to overthrow Caesar and Rome. He's not going to set up an earthly kingdom. We're not going to be part of his cabinet. I'm not going to have a high-ranking position. And slowly, that Judas became disillusioned. And that disillusionment turned to anger. And that anger turned to despisement, right, over time. And now, getting wind that the Jewish religious leaders wanted to kind of get rid of Jesus, now Judas says, okay, all right, I've given up 3 years of my life to follow this guy, thinking he was one thing. Now I find out he's another. Well, I'm angry. I've thrown away 3 years of my life. Now I want to get my revenge. So the thinking has always been, that's been kind of brewing in Judas. And that's what brought him to the point of betraying Jesus, and greedy though he was, settling for the price of a slave. That's how much he despised Jesus. So that gives us a little window into the heart and soul of Judas. But anyway, back to the narrative. They agree on the price, right? And Judas says, okay, I know exactly where he's going to be. Now, remember, this is Wednesday night. I know exactly where he's going to be tomorrow night, Thursday night, all right? He's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's going to be on the Mount of Olives. He's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'll take you right to him. And I'll even identify him for you. More about that in a second, right? Now, this begs the question. How did Judas know that Jesus was going to be on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane tomorrow night, Holy Thursday? How did he know that? Well, it turns out that the Garden of Gethsemane is a garden. It's on the Mount of Olives. It's out of the way. It's quiet, right? Jesus and his disciples had gone there before, during the 3 years of their public ministry. They had spent the night there several times. So Judas knew that being in Jerusalem, right? The Mount of Olives right across the way. Judas knew, yeah, that's where he was probably going to be. All right? So it wasn't an unknown spot to Jesus and the disciples, nor Judas. So that's why Judas was able to tell him, I know exactly where he's going to be. He's going to be on the Mount of Olives. He's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. I can take you to him. I can even identify him, okay? And he says, I'll identify him with a kiss. Now, why does he need to identify him? Well, again, this is first century, right? You don't have pictures of Jesus floating around everywhere. There's no social media, right? There's no iPhones, right? When the Jewish religious leaders gather people, right, gather some Roman soldiers and some temple guards to go to the garden and arrest Jesus, they might not know what Jesus looks like, Plus, it's a garden. It's pitch black. There's no street lights. This is first century. So they're going to arrive at this pitch black garden. They're not going to know necessarily which one Jesus is. So Judas says, no problem, I got that covered as well. I'll identify him with a kiss. Now this is another window into the soul of, into the heart and soul of Judas. Fine, Judas is going to identify him. But there's a lot of different ways he could identify him. He could have just pointed to him and said, that's the one. He could have tapped him on the shoulder and said, this is the one. He could have stood behind him and pointed to him. Of all the different ways Judas used to identify Jesus, he did it with one of those kisses on the cheek. And back then, and still now in many cultures, that was reserved for family members or very close friends. So the method he uses to identify Jesus so he can be arrested and killed was the kiss that family members and close friends gave to each other. That's cold. That's another window into how disillusioned and angry and bitter Judas was at this point. So while Jesus is teaching the crowds in the temple area on Wednesday, Judas is cutting this deal and laying the plans to betray Jesus. So you've got kind of this split screen going on. So Wednesday finishes, and once again, for the last time, because Thursday night, Jesus' disciples don't make it back to Bethany. Jesus is arrested, right? So this is the last time Wednesday night they leave Jerusalem, go back to Bethany, and spend the night at Martha, Mary, and Lazarus' house. All right? That's where we'll leave this episode, where we covered Teaching Tuesday and Spy Wednesday. So when we pick it up again next episode, it'll be morning of Holy Thursday. And again, we're going to, because so much happened, we're going to split Holy Thursday into 2 episodes. So with that, as I always say, thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. Thank you for supporting this series. Hopefully you're having a very holy and blessed Holy Week. And until next time, I'm Charles Merritt. God bless.